Muhammad Ali stood in the hallway outside the Supreme Court building, holding a single piece of paper. 4 years earlier they had stripped him of everything. His heavyweight title, his boxing license, his right to make a living. They had called him a coward, a traitor, a man who betrayed his country. But the paper in his hands told a different story. After 1,247 days of exile, the highest court in America had just admitted they were wrong. What happened next would prove that sometimes one man's conscience is more powerful than an entire government. And the way Ali handled his vindication shocked even his greatest supporters. If this story of standing up to injustice moves you, hit subscribe. Sometimes the greatest fights happen outside the ring. April 28, 1967, Houston, Texas. Muhammad Ali walked into the Armed Forces Examining and Entrance Station on San Jacinto Street at exactly 8 a.m. He was 25 years old, the heavyweight champion of the world, at the absolute peak of his powers. He had no idea that in 2 hours he would make a decision that would destroy his career, cost him millions of dollars, and turn half of America against him. The building was nondescript, a government facility that processed thousands of young men for military service during the height of the Vietnam War. But today was different. Today, the most famous athlete in the world was about to walk through those doors and change American history forever. Ali had barely slept the night before. He'd spent hours on his knees, praying, asking Allah for strength. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical force. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every young black man who'd been told to fight a war for a country that wouldn't let him eat at certain restaurants. This was about every Muslim who'd been told his faith didn't matter. This was about every person who'd ever had to choose between their conscience and their career. When Lieutenant Stephen Dunkley called out Cassius Marcellus Clay, Ali didn't move. The officer waited. The room fell silent. 18 other young men had already stepped forward when their names were called. Now every eye was on the heavyweight champion of the world. Cassius Marcellus Clay, the officer repeated, louder this time. Ali remained perfectly still. His hands were clasped behind his back. His face was calm, but his heart was pounding. In that moment he knew there was no going back. The officer looked directly at Ali. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Sir," I said, Cassius Marcellus Clay. Ali looked directly at Lieutenant Dunkley and said 4 words that would echo through American history. "I ain't going nowhere." The room erupted in whispers. Military personnel exchanged glances. Reporters who had been waiting outside somehow sensed that something historic was happening inside that government building. Within hours, the machinery of the United States government began grinding Muhammad Ali into dust. But here's what nobody knew at the time. The decision to destroy Muhammad Ali had been made weeks before he ever walked into that Houston induction center. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had personally marked Ali as a target. The boxing commissions had already prepared their suspension orders. The government had predetermined that Muhammad Ali would be made an example of, regardless of the legal merits of his case. This wasn't justice. This was a coordinated attack designed to break the most famous athlete in America. The New York State Athletic Commission met in emergency session. Without a hearing, without allowing Ali to defend himself, they immediately suspended his boxing license. The World Boxing Association followed suit, stripping him of his heavyweight title before the sun had set on that April day. Every state that regulated professional boxing banned him from fighting. The passport office revoked his passport so he couldn't fight overseas. In one afternoon, Muhammad Ali went from the most powerful athlete in the world to a man who couldn't legally earn a living doing the only thing he'd ever known how to do. But the government wasn't finished with him yet. The attacks came from every direction with the precision of a military campaign. The media, which had once celebrated Ali's wit and charisma, turned on him with vicious intensity. Editorial pages across the country condemned him as a coward and a draft dodger. Television commentators questioned his patriotism. Radio talk show hosts took calls from angry listeners demanding that Ali be stripped of his citizenship. Sports Illustrated, the magazine that had put Ali on its cover dozens of times, called him a discredit to his title, his sport, and his country. The New York Times wrote that Ali had disgraced the sport of boxing. Red Smith of the New York Herald Tribune suggested that Ali was nothing more than a performer who fattened on the country that gave him opportunity. But the cruelest blow came from someone Ali had considered a friend. Floyd Patterson, former heavyweight champion, and a man Ali had always respected, publicly challenged him to a fight, to bring the title back to America. The message was clear. Muhammad Ali was no longer considered a real American. The personal attacks were even worse than the professional ones. Ali received thousands of death threats. The FBI began monitoring his every move. His phone calls were tapped. His mail was intercepted. Government agents followed him wherever he went, taking photographs, recording conversations, building a file that would eventually contain over 100,000 pages. What the FBI was looking for was evidence that Ali was a communist agent, or that his religious conversion was fake. What they found after years of intensive surveillance was nothing more damaging than a young man trying to live according to his religious beliefs. The financial devastation was immediate and crushing. Before his refusal, Ali was earning approximately $4 million per year. By the summer of 1967, his income had dropped to zero. The IRS began pursuing him for back taxes on money he could no longer earn. His training camp in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania fell into disrepair. The sparring partners who had once competed for the privilege of working with the heavyweight champion disappeared. The hangers-on who had always surrounded Ali melted away like snow in summer. Ali was forced to sell his cars, his jewelry, anything of value. The man who had once boasted about his wealth now struggled to pay his basic expenses. Friends remembered seeing Ali counting change to buy groceries, something that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. His business manager, Herbert Mohammed, tried to find alternative sources of income. They arranged speaking engagements at colleges and universities, but these appearances paid very little, often just enough to cover travel expenses, and they frequently made Ali's situation worse by drawing more negative publicity. The emotional toll was even more devastating than the financial loss. Ali tried to maintain his public persona, the brash, confident showman who had captivated the world, but privately, he was crumbling. His first marriage to Sonia Roy fell apart under the pressure. She couldn't handle the constant scrutiny, the death threats, the financial uncertainty. The isolation was perhaps the hardest thing to bear. Ali had always been surrounded by people, trainers, sparring partners, reporters, fans. There had always been a crowd around Muhammad Ali. Now he found himself alone for the first time in his adult life. His brother Rahman, who had converted to Islam with him, was one of the few people who stood by him during those dark days. But even Rahman sometimes questioned whether the sacrifice had been worth it. There were nights when even Ali's faith wavered. Close friends later revealed that there were moments when the pressure became almost unbearable. The champion who had never backed down from anyone found himself questioning whether he had the strength to continue. The government made it clear that all he had to do was apologize. Just a simple statement saying he had been wrong to refuse induction, and his boxing license would be restored. His title could be returned. The money would flow again. All he had to do was compromise his principles. Muhammad Ali never wavered. For 3.5 years, Muhammad Ali lived in exile from the sport he loved. The prime of his athletic career, ages 25 to 28, was stolen from him. Joe Frazier became heavyweight champion. The boxing world moved on without its greatest star. A whole generation of boxing fans grew up never seeing Muhammad Ali fight. The legal battle dragged on endlessly. Appeals were filed and rejected. Motions were made and denied. The case worked its way slowly through the federal court system, while Ali's career slipped away one day at a time. His lawyers warned him that he could face 5 years in federal prison. The government was serious about making an example of Muhammad Ali. They wanted to show that fame and wealth couldn't protect you from the consequences of defying the United States military. But then something unexpected began to happen. By 1970, public opinion about the Vietnam War was shifting dramatically. The Pentagon Papers had revealed that the government had misled the public about the war from the beginning. College campuses across the country were erupting in protest. Young people who had initially condemned Ali for his refusal to serve were beginning to see him as a prophet rather than a traitor. The same sports writers who had called Ali a coward began to quietly suggest that maybe he had been right all along. The same politicians who had condemned him stayed silent when his name came up. The tide was turning, but slowly. Then came the phone call that changed everything. June 28, 1971. Muhammad Ali was sitting in his lawyer's office in Chicago when Chauncey Eskridge's phone rang. Ali watched his attorney's face as he listened to the voice on the other end. Eskridge's expression went from confusion to shock to something approaching disbelief. Eskridge hung up the phone and turned to face his client. For a moment, the veteran civil rights attorney was speechless. "Champ," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the Supreme Court just ruled 8-0 in your favor. You're completely exonerated." The words hung in the air between them. After 4 years, 4 months and 2 days, the highest court in America had vindicated Muhammad Ali. For a long moment, Ali didn't speak. He just stared at his lawyer, trying to process words he had waited 1,247 days to hear. The Supreme Court had ruled in Clay v. United States that the government's case against Ali had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Justice Potter Stewart, writing for the majority, concluded that the Department of Justice had failed to properly advise the draft board about Ali's claim for conscientious objector status. But the technical details didn't matter to Ali. What mattered was that the United States government had admitted they were wrong. The coward was vindicated. The traitor was proven to be a patriot. The man who had been stripped of everything had his honor restored. But Ali's reaction to vindication surprised everyone. When reporters reached him for comment, they expected anger. They expected him to lash out at the government that had stolen 4 years of his life. They expected him to demand apologies from the critics who had called him a coward. They expected vindictive satisfaction. Instead, Ali said something that stunned the sports world. "I harbor no bitterness toward anyone. I just thank Allah that the truth finally came out." That was it. No attacks on his enemies. No demands for retribution. No "I told you so" speeches. Just gratitude that justice had been served. The contrast was stunning. The government had spent 4 years calling Ali unpatriotic. He responded to his vindication with grace and forgiveness that embodied the best of American values. But the story of Ali's vindication had layers that wouldn't be revealed for years. Behind the scenes, the Supreme Court decision had been far more dramatic than anyone knew. Court documents that were unsealed decades later revealed that the justices had initially been split on Ali's case. Some had wanted to uphold his conviction. Others had serious doubts about the government's handling of the case. Justice John Marshall Harlan, a conservative who had initially been inclined to rule against Ali, had changed his mind after reading the full record of the case. He was reportedly disturbed by what he saw as government misconduct in the handling of Ali's conscientious objector claim. The final 8-0 decision was a complete rebuke of the government's treatment of Muhammad Ali. But perhaps most remarkably, Justice Potter Stewart, who wrote the majority opinion, had initially been skeptical of Ali's claims. Court insiders later revealed that Stewart had spent hours studying Islamic doctrine to better understand Ali's religious objections to the war. The vindication opened the floodgates for Ali's return to boxing. State boxing commissions that had banned him for 4 years suddenly welcomed him back. The same sports writers who had called him a coward now praised his courage. The first major fight after his complete vindication was his epic battle with Joe Frazier on March 8, 1971 at Madison Square Garden. Ali lost that fight, knocked down in the 15th round by a devastating left hook from Frazier. But he had already won something more important. He had proven that individual conscience could stand up to government power and ultimately prevail. Financial experts estimated that the 4-year exile had cost him at least $10 million in direct earnings. But the indirect costs were even higher. Ali lost his peak earning years, the time when a heavyweight champion makes the most money. But Ali never expressed regret about the sacrifice. "They took my title," he said years later. "They took my prime earning years. They called me a traitor and a coward. But I kept something more valuable than any of that. I kept my dignity." The Supreme Court's vindication of Muhammad Ali didn't just restore his boxing license and clear his criminal record. It restored his place in American history as a man who had been willing to sacrifice everything for his beliefs and had ultimately been proven right. When Muhammad Ali lit the Olympic torch at the 1996 Summer Games in Atlanta, his hands trembling from Parkinson's disease, the entire world stood and cheered. The country that had once tried to destroy him was now celebrating him as one of its greatest heroes. They took everything from Muhammad Ali: his title, his career, his money, his reputation. They called him every name in the book. They tried to break his spirit and destroy his legacy. But in the end, the Supreme Court admitted what Ali had known all along. He was right, and they were wrong. And that vindication was worth more than any championship belt ever could be.